Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. They say that love begins with a spark, a glance, a touch, a shared laugh. These are the distinctive traits of attraction. That said, love also has the tendency to, depending on your attachment style, evolve into insecurity, fear, envy. But what if these qualities were there all along, underlining their initial romantic interactions? So that's what we're exploring this week under the guidance of postdoctoral research fellow Dr. Marissa Nivison, whose research focuses on how early childhood relationships with parents shape attachment quality across the lifespan, including romantic relationships. Hi, Marissa. Thank you for joining us on the show. How are you going?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you here. So I'm really keen to get into this topic, but before we begin, I would love to ask you some basic introductory questions to give us a little glimpse into this world before opening the door entirely and just running through it. So firstly, what are some common misconceptions you've heard about attachment styles?
Yeah, so one of the major things I hear about attachment is that it's kind of this end all be all explainer of all human behavior. And that's really not that case. It's really just one aspect of, a person's psychology.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle piece, and it's not the entire thing. Right, that's really interesting. And also, your research focuses on childhood maltreatment. So, could you share with us how experiences of neglect or abuse can shape attachment styles and in turn impact how individuals form new relationships?
Yeah, so it really depends on kind of who's perpetrating this abuse. If you have abuse or neglect that's, being done by your parent or your primary caregiver, that's where we kind of see this more detrimental effect to attachment itself. Of course, we have ample literature to show that, like abuse and neglect are bad. So, not to say that they're not. But if you think about the fact that parents are supposed to be this source of comfort, and so when they're the source of distress, that really gets complicated, and you as a person kind of get a little confused about what it is you should expect from relationships when the person who's your source of comfort is also kind of the person who might be, abusing you.
Yeah, well, that serves as a great preface for our topic for today. But before we get further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So, this is Have You Met Marissa? And the first question I have for you is what do you like to do in your spare time?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time reading and baking. I'm a big baker and traveling and hanging out with friends and such.
Oh, that's really nice. So, do you have like signature dishes in your repertoire?
I would say my favorite is probably macarons. That's actually my cat's name. It's Rooney for short, but I think that's one of my favorite things to make.
I love a homemade macaron. It hits different than store-bought ones, 100%. But the last time I made macarons, they turned out to be like wrinkly grandpas. They looked like old wrinkly people. So do you have any tips for me?
Yeah, so oftentimes you really have to like take your sheet pan and like bang it against the counter before you bake them to release all the air bubbles, which usually like cause cracking. So make sure you bang that against the counter first.
Yeah, I swear I did it. I think the other thing is that I made them way too big. I didn't have any of the macaron circle guide things, and I just went with my feeling. I didn't realize that they expanded. So
They definitely do.
So that was, it's probably like an amalgamation of mistakes that turned them into wrinkly people.
Yeah, so they're really, really tricky. So it's like one of those small things. And there's nothing more disappointing than when you're spending so much time making them and then they just come out terrible.
Yeah, at least they tasted good though.
That's really all that matters, right?
Yeah, that's honestly all that matters. Unless you're giving it to people, in which case, maybe not. But yeah, I love baking too. Apart from macarons, is there anything else that you enjoy baking?
I really like baking all sorts of things. Something that I'm really I like to do is, so I have my own like dietary problems. I'm fructose intolerant, which is like a whole thing. But adjusting recipes to be, you know, gluten-free or like vegan so that like everyone can have, you know, good dessert is one of the kind of my favorite hobbies.
Oh, that's amazing. That's such a good hobby to have. So when did you start learning how to bake gluten-free and for different dietary requirements?
So my sister was actually diagnosed with celiac disease, I think in her mid-20s, so it's pretty late. And so I think I had already been baking a lot by then, so I wanted to try and make things that she was having a hard time finding in the store.
Oh, that is so sweet and so heartfelt. Now, aside from baking, are there any films, books, or TV shows that you enjoy consuming?
Yeah, so I'm definitely a big Sally Rooney fan. Conversations with Friends is my favorite book probably of all time. She has a new book coming out, which I'm so excited about. I love the movie Matilda and the book as well. I'm also a big like period piece girly, so like Emma or Pride and Prejudice. I am a 2005 Pride and Prejudice fan, not necessarily the BBC version,
And
which I know is controversial.
And what do you like about period pieces?
I feel like I've always really enjoyed the kind of grand costume and like Regency era. Of course, like the fictionalized aspect of it, because real life Regency era probably was terrible. But it's kind of like a different sort of dress up and pretend.
Yeah, for sure. I love immersing myself into period TV shows and movies as well. Especially the ones that are a bit more fictionalized. I don't know why, but it's almost fantasy. It's very fantasy-esque without the magic and the witches and whatnot. There's that, like you said, that grandeur and yeah, I do agree that like real life Regency era probably would have not looked so great with the like diseases and people sleeping in the same beds. I don't think I would have been able to live through that. But
no, especially not. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say, but
yeah, but it's nice to picture it. So yeah, I love those TV shows too. So the next thing I wanted to ask you was, is there someone in your life that you look up to either professionally or personally?
So I think I would have to say I've been like blessed with really great mentors throughout my both like academic and personal life. People who've really helped guide me both, you know, personally and set me on the career trajectory that I'm on, including my high school teacher, my college advisor, my graduate advisor, and my now current postdoc advisor. I've had some really, really great mentors who definitely have helped me get where I am. And
That's
I really look up to them.
Yeah, that's great. So, what traits of theirs do you find most admirable?
Yeah, so all of them are quite realistic in the sense of kind of knowing what we as like people can do in the field of psychology to make it a better science, to translate our science and to share it with the community. And they're just very kind and intelligent and hardworking people. And I've learned so much from them, and they've been such incredible presences in my life. And I
Yeah.
hope to be that kind of mentor as well.
Yeah, that's great. Now, lastly, how would you define relationships?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I would say a relationship is a bond that forms between two people that can take many different forms, but it does, require a level of intimacy in some way, whether that's professionally or through friendship or romantically, but someone you trust, you want to be around, kind of more than just like acquaintanceship, where it is actually a meaningful relationship, not to use the definition or the word in the definition.
Yeah, that's a great way to lead us into the interview. So, we're talking about attachment styles and how they shape relationship beginnings today. So, to start off with, what are the different attachment styles and what is an attachment style?
Yeah, so attachment, as originally defined by John Bowlby, who was a British doctor in the 1960s, is this really emotional and enduring bond between a parent and a child. That's kind of how it was first brought to the scene of science. But this idea of attachment is that you have this attachment figure, this person who's there when you're in distress. You feel comfortable going to them. They help resolve your conflict by both like providing some action to solve it, to emotionally comfort you. And at the end of the day, they're the kind of person who's there to make you feel better. And we kind of categorize attachment in two main ways, what we call attachment security and attachment insecurity. And insecure attachment is kind of broken up a little bit more. But attachment security is essentially this idea that you have this positive attachment figure in your life that you do feel comfortable going to, and that they do help, resolve your conflict.
Yeah. So, how would you describe how it affects the initial stages of a romantic relationship, because that's quite a far cry, like in the grand scheme of stages of life.
Yeah, so the way I've always thought about it is that, and I'm just going to be using the term parents, but I fully acknowledge that there's other caregivers who form, the parenting role. But when an infant is born, that those parents are really the people who teach them what it means to have a relationship. So it's almost kind of like an architect building a house. You see, how you design it, what materials you use, and you kind of have this idea of what a house should look like. And then we see that across the entire like development, the way in which you think about your relationships with your parents affects how you form relationships with friends in school and with teachers. And then later, it's just using the same applied map of what relationships look like when you come to romantic relationships.
Yeah. So yeah, that seems like that's a foundation of relationships, that like when parents show the kids what their relationship is like, that builds that foundation, and it's really hard later on to correct it, but it's still possible. But that's a whole different other topic that we could go into. So, are there any telltale signs in the early stages of dating that might hint at someone's attachment style? And like, what are the what is the discussion of morality here? Is it ethical to surmise what someone's attachment style might be?
Yeah, so like we mentioned about the early misconceptions, attachment really is not this end all be all of relationships. And therefore, I'm not sure if in my own personal relationships I would necessarily try to like suss out what the attachment style was, but I would actually pay more attention to how that attachment is manifesting. So things like communication style, trust, like are they there for me when I need them? Conversely, are they accepting support when I offer it to them? So it's kind of these facets of attachment that we see that are probably more important than the actual categorical attachment style itself.
Yeah, for sure. So it's like someone could have an insecure attachment style, but if they do recognize that and act in a healthy manner and communicate in a healthy manner, then that means more than having an insecure attachment style.
Yeah. And one other thing is there's kind of this debate in the research field about attachment as this kind of general concept versus attachment specific to people. So we do see that people who may have a history of insecure attachment to their parents may still have secure relationships with their romantic partners. So just because they have a history of that doesn't mean that they're going to continue to have insecure attachment to that person.
That's really interesting. So why do you think the attachments why do you think attachment theory has blown up so much around, like as a topic of discussion? Like, people are always talking about how they've a chaotic attachment style or something like that, or disordered attachment style, and kind of using that as a crux sometimes.
Yeah. So, I mean, not to, be biased, but I do find it very fascinating. So, for someone like me, when I first came to university, I started learning about attachment. And it's just something that applies to everyone. So, I do really think that that's one of the main reasons why it's so big, because it truly does matter to every single person. I also think that it provides people with kind of this conceptualization or this roadmap to how maybe they are with their own parents and how their childhood was. And, it's also one of those theories within psychology that's, although can be misconstrued, is quite easy to understand. And so I think a lot of that has to do with how big it's been.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think part of it is probably also like it's an easy way to contextualize your behavior, or to give someone context to how your why your behavior is the way it is. So that makes so much sense. Another thing is that attachment theory does place emphasis on internal working models. So could you elaborate on what these internal working models are and what kind of role it plays overall?
Yeah. So in infancy, we kind of look at attachment as when the child or the infant is in distress, do they physically go to their parent? Do their parents kind of pick them up, comfort them? Does the child seem to then return back to play as normal? And so, what we see about these internal working models is that it's kind of like a cognitive schema, or again, kind of like a roadmap in your head. If you were to think right now, oh, I'm in trouble, I'm upset, what do I do? A person with a secure attachment might be like, I'm going to seek support, I'm going to call someone, versus an insecure person might, deal with it on their own. So it's this idea of these internalized expectations of relationships that we see. Again, returning to this, map of what we expect relationships to be is really how I conceptualize an internal working model.
Right. And so how does the internal working model influence how someone perceives themselves?
Yeah. So the internal working model is something that's not necessarily something that an individual is conscious of on the regular basis. This is more of something we tap into as researchers. But I would imagine that it would affect a person subliminally, kind of, again, same in that way of, I'm upset, I'll just deal with this on my own. And it's more of those like coping mechanisms that are related to attachment. Again, attachment or internal working model being this like foundation, and then behavior stemming from there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How much of an effect does it have on relationships?
That is a good question. So it really depends on the type of relationship. It depends on the people that are in the relationship, what somebody else is coming in with, what you're coming in with. So not to not answer your question, but it's just can vary so much. But at the very minimum, I would say everyone is coming into relationships with their own ideas and expectations, whether that's, conscious or unconscious.
Yeah. And when it comes to transitioning from casual dating or like the early stages of relationships to a more long-term relationship, the transition period can be quite confusing, tumultuous, perplexing, hard to figure out. So how do the various attachment styles deal with this situation? What are some common pitfalls that prospective couples should be aware of?
Yeah, so I definitely think something to be aware of is what your expectations are, what your needs are in a relationship, and how you feel about whether your partner is meeting those needs emotionally and just being there for you. One of those, if we're to break down insecure attachment a little bit, we kind of see three main categories of avoidance, ambivalence/resistance, and disorganization. I'll just focus on avoidance and ambivalence right now. So as someone who's avoidant might, as it implies in the name, be kind of hard to get, hard to nail down. When you go to them, they don't really want to deal with your problems. Conversely, they don't want to accept support, versus someone who's more ambivalent might be kind of coming on a little strong and being, a little more anxious about what this relationship is, what this means, and kind of, needing this security that they don't feel that they're getting. And so it really is kind of this compatibility thing, and not only based on attachment, based on a bunch of different factors, but when your expectations of a relationship are different than your partner's, when your needs aren't being met, that's going to, maybe cause some of this chaos.
Right. Yeah. And do attachment styles influence long-term commitment and fidelity at all?
So there's been some preliminary research that's been done on this. Attachment and romantic relationships is kind of divided between the social psychology world and the developmental psychology world. And I'm more a developmentalist. And so it really depends on how you're measuring attachment, what you're looking at. But we do see that romantic relationships tend to be more attachment relationships the longer you have been in a relationship. I'm not as familiar with the fidelity research. That's a little outside of my expertise. But again, if your needs are not being met, whether those are emotional or physical, or you're just not on the same page as your partner for whatever reason, perhaps that is, maybe you're secure, your partner is more avoidant, it is possible that, fidelity might be an issue. But again, this is just me thinking about it, postulating.
And in what ways can partners with different attachment styles communicate, build, and maintain trust?
Yeah, so I keep returning to this idea of thinking about what it is you need and what it is your partner will accept and vice versa. So one example I can think of is perhaps you have a partner who is amazing at listening to you when you need to vent. They're great at providing support. But when it comes to times when they are kind of in distress or having a hard time, they just want to be alone and don't go to you for support. And if that's okay with you, that's great. But sometimes that can cause conflicts in the relationship where the first partner is kind of feeling anxious about why their partner doesn't come to them, why don't they trust them? And so, kind of having these ideas about what it is we expect from each other, both in giving and receiving, and knowing full well that when we have this history of insecurity, it's really hard to overcome those, initial like lights in your head saying, avoid, avoid. But working together, excuse me, working together with your partner actually can help manifest a secure attachment with one another and really kind of working toward what it is you expect from one another is really important.
Oh yeah, 100%. I feel like also, for example, with avoidant people with avoidant attachment styles, let's say your partner comes to you and says like, why don't you share some of your problems with me? And the avoidant attachment style person goes like, well, I don't want to burden you, I don't want to like put my problems on anyone else. What the other person can do is, confide in them about how sharing, like problem sharing and problem solving together, makes them happy. So it's like framing it in a way of like, if you share your problems with me, that would make me so happy, and that would like make me feel a lot, it will just, it feels like teamwork, and it makes me feel a bit more like a bit closer to you. I feel like I'm doing something together. So I would love that, rather than like a, you never share your problems with me, and you like, do you not trust me, how could you, rather than the accusatory um outlet would be amazing, I think. But I can't like say for every single relationship, obviously, because yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great example. Of course, I'm not advocating that tell your partner every single problem, but it's really when it becomes a source of like conflict or contention in a relationship, that's where it might, cause these anxieties and these resentments. And sometimes people just need time alone to process things, and that is completely fine. But I do know that oftentimes a partner will say, I need to sit with this by myself for a bit, but I will come to you when I'm ready. Kind of creating that communication where it's not that I don't trust you to tell you, it's just I need some time first with it.
Yeah, for sure. And going the route of being, of like accusing your partner of not trusting you, or like asking all these questions and not giving them their space, it doesn't really help the situation at all. Like your partner's not going to turn around magically 180 and go like, you know what, yeah, I can share all my problems with you now, and I'm like secure in doing so, like I think part of it is definitely like learning what makes your partner feel this way, and why they are feeling that way, and then it makes it a lot easier to on yourself to like understand and give them that space, or give them the support that they need.
Definitely. And sometimes, no matter even if you are trying your best and you have the communication, sometimes people just aren't compatible with where somebody else needs them to be. For like, somebody could need your partner to come to you at every turn,
Mhm.
and that's okay, but maybe this just isn't the right relationship, or what I just mean that this isn't like a fix all for relationships. There's very a lot of aspects of relationships that come into play.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But there is also an abundance of research that shows that attachment styles can change over time. So, could you tell us about why this is, how plausible this is, what this depends on?
Definitely. So that's actually one of the main reasons I love attachment theory and why I've dedicated my entire career to it is that attachment can change. So despite what your circumstances were growing up, you can choose to have better relationships in your life if you want them. Of course, it is so much work. It's very hard, but sometimes it happens naturally. The biggest way in research that we see attachment kind of shift and change to more secure is through relationships. When you have a healing relationship where, someone is providing you that support that you weren't used to, they're essentially teaching you how a supportive relationship can be. And it's a big adjustment when you're trying to learn what it is to be loved in a way that you should be and all of that. So again, the biggest way is through relationships, but we also see clinical intervention. One-on-one therapy is kind of the way we see it with adults who aren't in romantic relationships, things like that. But I can dive into more of the mechanisms if you're interested in that too.
Yes, please do. Please tell us more about the mechanisms.
Yeah, so I'll just give an example. So if you have someone who's coming from a household where their parent was sometimes there for them, but sometimes not, very inconsistent, the child kind of learns that if they keep going to their parent, 50% of the time their parent will be there. So they always are kind of pushing toward. And sometimes that can be in translating into adulthood, that kind of can be coming on too strong a little bit. Those what are we conversations, that needing that assurance and that security and having these, ideas that this relationship isn't consistent, it isn't stable, at any time they could leave and having all of those anxieties and those fears. If you have a partner who recognizes those fears, understands where they come from, understand that, it's not a thing for them to fight about or to argue, but working with a partner to be I understand why you're feeling this way, but I'm here for you. We can work through this together. My behavior has consistently shown that I'm here. And then just even not even those direct in your face things, but eventually you learn when you can trust a person, when you can rely on them, when you know that they're there for you. So even just by being in a relationship that's different than what you've experienced, you slowly start to pick up, oh, they're not my parent. I can go to them. And even just these things that are happening even without, conscious effort too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So to get a bit more personal, how has your understanding of attachment theory influenced your own relationships? Are there any personal anecdotes that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, so something that I've definitely found myself doing is that because I'm in this field, it's so easy to intellectualize things and kind of break down oh, this is why I'm feeling this way, this is why I'm acting this way, but it's completely different from actually feeling those feelings. So I know that I have a tendency in relationships with avoidant people who kind of give me their attention one day and then they don't give me their attention the next. I feel like I need to work hard to get that attention. And when they're not kind of shining their light on me, I have to do everything in my power to get that light back on me. And that's not healthy. That's not what you want. And that definitely took a long time for me to be I don't have to work so hard. I don't have to do this tap dance to get their attention. That's not how a relationship should be. And so just understanding where my own personal history was coming into play and that I was going down this path because this is what felt right to me. and then realizing that actually, no, I'm miserable. This isn't what I want. And even though this is what I'm used to, doesn't mean that this is what I deserve.
Yeah, for sure. I have a pretty similar experience as well. I do have a tendency to intellectualize everything in relationships, or I used to at least. And my thought process was that would make it easier emotionally to process. I wouldn't have to process it emotionally because I can remove the emotions by intellectualizing it, and then I understand their behaviors. But it has to be a two-way street, because if I'm doing all the work of intellectualizing what's going on and interpreting the emotions, but they're not communicating to me, then the relationship is dead. There's no point in that.
Yeah, definitely. Intellectualization is definitely something I struggle with as well. Because it also kind of creates this element of rationalization for their behaviors. It's like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
they're behaving in this way because their dad wasn't always there for them. And so for me, I was always like, and that's why. And that makes it okay. But like, no.
I feel like this is such I feel like this is such a common pipeline to go through before getting to like a healing place. So what advice do you have for people who may be in that position?
Yeah, I would say as much as possible, step back and read how you're actually feeling, not necessarily toward the person, but in your interactions with them. Are you feeling fulfilled? Are you feeling happy? Do you enjoy the time around them? Like when it's hard, is it worth it? I just know that it took me such a long time to realize that I was actually miserable. And even these like slight ideas of glimpses of happiness were nothing compared to the miserableness I was experiencing.
Oh, 100%. And I I think like one thing that people like us tend to do is also like have a really really low bar for people that we date, thinking that like, oh, that will make up for it, or like, oh, we have low expectations, like, that's the least, that then if we have low expectations we can't get hurt because our expectations are so low. But guess what, you can get you can get hurt.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not a bottom line to getting hurt.
Yeah.
And when you're used to the bare minimum and you get the bare minimum, it seems like you're getting what you should be getting, but there's so much more out
Yes,
there.
100%. The moment I raised my bar, I never looked back. Everything changed. So much happier
Yeah.
and so much less work.
And there's actually been a lot of research to show that when you have high expectations and you hold out for happiness, you do have higher quality relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I think one of the fears, well, I can't speak for everybody, but I think one of my fears when I did have a really low bar for dating was that I was afraid that if someone came in who did give me a lot, I wouldn't be able to compare. So part of that's also like raising your self-esteem a little bit, and like teaching yourself some self-compassion, because you do deserve that. And like even if you don't think you're there, how about like, thinking of it as a way to like motivate yourself to be better and to improve as well, so that you can give back what this person is giving you, because you do deserve that.
Yeah, and something that we do see with people who have a history of insecure attachment is that oftentimes you do have, a lower sense of worth, lower self confidence. And so you kind of decide that you deserve what you're being treated as because that's, what you're used to, what you've been told to expect. But that's just not true.
Yeah. Well, for those people who may not be familiar with attachment theory, what advice do you have for identifying their own attachment style?
Yeah, so I think again, just asking yourself some general questions about what it is you expect. So, when you're in times of trouble, what do you do? Do you keep it to yourself? Do you tend to call somebody else? When you call that person, do they make you feel better? Kind of thinking out, your expectations of how that person will respond. And it's just kind of falling back on this model of like, in times of distress, how do I utilize the relationships in my life?
Yeah. And are there any books, articles, or resources that you'd recommend for our listeners who want to dive a bit deeper into attachment theory?
Yeah, so one place I would definitely start is there's an academic organization called the Society for Emotion and Attachment Studies, and they have a great kind of outreach support where they define what attachment is, what this looks like, and they provide a lot of resources for books. And there's a lot of excerpts for YouTube videos of these like professors and these talks and really breaking things down into understandable terms. So I would definitely start there. The conversation is incredible for reading about these kind of like higher level constructs. If you're not familiar, it's kind of this news article source that's written by experts in terms that anyone can understand. And so if you were to go to the conversation and you just type in attachment, you have at least 2 articles from me explaining both romantic attachment and early attachment, and there's so many more.
Yeah. It's also independently run, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those sound like amazing recommendations. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll link those in the show notes. Now we'll move on to the practices and habits section, and we'll talk a little bit about the more practical sides of attachment theory. So for starters, what is a habit that you would recommend practicing to work towards a secure attachment style?
Yeah, so these are just some basic level recommendations, but I do recommend seeking out some more clinical resources. But I think reflection is a really big aspect of any relationship. So if you're having a disagreement with a partner, kind of stepping back, thinking about how you're feeling, reflect where, those beliefs that you have or might be stemming from, thinking about whether or not you would, recommend that for somebody else to be following the same path. Kind of just really thinking about your behaviors, your feelings, and opening up about communication with, your partner or your friend, your parent, and just thinking about how all of this is making you feel. How you feel is really important.
Yeah, and what are some of the challenges that come with this? I know that um emotion blindness is a thing that some people do experience, and even if it's not like the most severe form of emotion blindness, some people have really hard time identifying what those emotions are. So what do you think the challenges and the struggles are there? What advice do you have for that?
So, yes, we also see that people with histories of insecure attachment are also less likely to be explicitly taught like emotion identification. That was something I had to teach myself in my early 20s, predominantly through individualized therapy. But yes, it does require you to have a level of self-awareness and the ability to identify feelings. And it's a really hard thing to do, but there are several sources online. One of the biggest things, I know that this is probably seems like an easy suggestion and less practical, but individual therapy is incredible for that. And so it is hard, and there is resistance, and there is a lot of work that goes into it, but kind of just breaking things down. I've found that when I don't understand how I'm feeling, I write it down, and then I can step away and relook at that and be like, oh, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. It does look like I'm sad about this or I'm angry. Really just starting with those like base level emotions like anger, sadness, fear, anxiety, and going from there.
Yeah, those are really, really good pieces of advice. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's move on to the open mic. And this is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to the topic at all. So the floor is entirely yours. Please take it away.
Yeah, I guess I just want to mention that. So, what we've been talking about today is really how attachment is related to romantic relationships. But, attachment is related to every relationship that you may have. Not all relationships are attachment relationships, but all relationships have the potential to be an attachment relationship. And so, something else to think about too is how if you are planning on becoming a parent, you are then becoming the person that is transmitting this attachment. And we see that people who have a strong romantic attachment to their partner, that's also their co-parent, are more likely to have children with secure attachments. And so we see that if you're a person who is planning on having children, the attachment quality does not just affect you, but it affects the next generation as well. And that's one of the biggest research questions we have and clinical questions we have in attachment is understanding how to pass on secure attachment.
That is so fascinating. And we see that as well with younger millennials and Gen Zs trying to slow down that process of generational trauma. So that's incredibly fascinating. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that it has been an incredible time to be in psychology and honestly to be alive because there's so much more awareness. And we really are working toward destigmatization of mental health and opening resources. And we do see that we can change what has come before. So, and that's the entire reason I'm in the research that I'm in, because I do want to make any child's life and adults who may have experienced negativity better.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nivison, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
You could probably go to my Twitter page. It's just at Marissa Nivison. That's probably the easiest way to see what I've been up to. That's where I put out all my new research articles, my new articles and the conversation, things like that.
Amazing. We'll link those in the show notes. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at re.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.